Hey guys, hey, how are you doing? Hey, I hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to another episode of a Film Life Vlog. So I don't say this often, but after I used this lovely camera here, the Pentax A3000 camera, this beauty right here. After I used this camera, I was asking myself, is this the perfect film camera? Seriously, that was a question that I kept asking myself. Because to be honest with you, it just felt like the perfect film camera. Stick with me and I'll explain. So for this episode, I will be doing a review of this lovely camera here. And like I said, I so much enjoyed shooting with this camera. Everything about this camera for me just felt like it was designed for perfection. I mean, the perfect camera for not just a beginner, but also for even someone that is even an advanced film enthusiast. I would consider myself an advanced film enthusiast, and I found this camera to be very, very enjoyable to shoot with, and not too simple. I mean, when you see this camera, take a good look at the top of this camera, you will notice right away that the shooting modes is not a lot, right? There's not a lot, to show for here. There's just the bulb setting, which is indicated here by the B over here. Then there's also a flash sync setting, which is the 60 with the flash sign right there, and then there's the program setting, and then there's the lock, and then there's the battery check position here. That's it. It's not a lot, really. However, I'll explain why this camera is deceptively powerful. In the bulb setting, you can basically set this camera to any shutter speed that you so desire. All you have to do is to use a threaded shutter release cable right there, insert it right there, and you will be able to basically control the shutter speed to whichever time you so desire. In the program setting right here, what is really unique about this program setting is that the camera acts as an aperture priority camera. As long as you attach these lenses to it, basically a Pentax lens that has the aperture ring on it, this camera will basically do the adjustments for you in terms of the shutter speed, depending on the aperture setting that you set here. And that aperture priority mode, guys, that's pretty awesome. That's what I found to be awesome about this. I've taken this camera for a spin. I've actually shot images with this camera. However, I will be including those images in another review that I will be doing just separately for this lens. For this review, I just want to focus on the features of the camera body itself and how awesome it is. Basically, as you can tell, I can't hide the fact that I really enjoyed shooting with this camera. The number one thing I love about this camera, when you take a hold of this camera, the thing you notice straight away is how ergonomic it is. It's light. It's a nice, slim form factor. It almost feels like a rangefinder, to be honest with you. It's so slim. It does not feel like an SLR. It's so nice to hold. It's perfect for street photography. You could hold this camera for hours and not tire at all. If you're going for a walk, if you're going for a hike, if you're going on vacation, this is a great camera to have. And because you don't have to fiddle with all these different settings, for a beginner, there's no excuse really to learn how to use this camera, because at the program mode here, which is an aperture priority mode, that's more than plenty for you. All you have to do is just worry about the setting, the aperture setting on this, the depth of field setting that you desire, and the camera will give you the shutter speed setting. Now, just so you know, the shutter speeds for this camera range from 2 seconds, a maximum of 2 seconds, to the fastest speed you can get on this is 1/1000th of a second. That's the fastest speed you can get. So that said, if ever your aperture setting is such that your shutter speed is going to be higher than 1/1000th of a second, if you look through the viewfinder, you will notice that there will be 1000 display over here. There's a lit LCD display in the viewfinder, and you will notice it flashing. And when it flashes, it simply means that your aperture is too wide, or the environment that you're trying to shoot is too bright. Basically, it's so bright that 1/1000th of a second is still not sufficient. And if that happens, you either decrease your aperture size, which is increasing your aperture, or you find a way of dimming. I think I just wasted a shot. Or you find a way of dimming your light coming through. One way to achieve that will be to use an ND filter, or you could use a polarizing filter like the one that I have on right now. That helps to dim the light that's coming through this. And depending on the rating of the ND filter, you could reduce it by 1 to several stops, 6 stops, 4 stops. It just depends on the rating that you want. So right on the top, there's also the ISO dial right here. There's a shutter release button right here. And there is over here the indicator for your film advanced position right here. Now if you notice, right on top of this dial, the ISO dial, is the lever. That's the film rewind lever right there. To load film into this camera, it's simple. There's a red line that you're gonna see right here when you open. Right now I've loaded this with film, so I cannot expose it. But there's a red line right here. You open the back, you put in your film, a canister in there, you stretch your film to that red line, and then you close the back. And once you close the back, all you have to do is depress the shutter release button, and then it will advance it through several clicks until it gets to the number 1 position, and then you're ready to shoot. It's just as simple as that. When you're done shooting, it doesn't automatically rewind. You will use the film rewind lever here, and that's as simple as it gets. There are 2 things you should know about the ISO dial on this camera. If you use a film that has a DX code on it, then this here doesn't do anything. You could change this to any number here. It will not affect your ISO rating of the film. Basically, the DX code will override the ISO setting that this dial allows you to set, right? If you're using film that does not have a DX code, then you could actually set your ISO rating right here. Now that's the only thing that I found that I did not like too much about this camera. I wish that this would be the overriding feature, that I could basically overexpose my film just by setting this to ISO, say ISO 100 if it's an ISO 200 film that I loaded in there. I wish I could do it simply by doing that. If you want to get around that, you just put a little masking tape on your film canister covering the DX code, and then you're basically deceiving the camera that there's no DX code on the film, and then you will set your ISO with this dial, right? It's pretty simple enough. So it's not a big deal. You can really override that feature if you do want. There's a self timer right here. To engage it, you just switch it up. I find that to be useful. It actually works on this camera. I'm not a big fan of self timers, but it is there if you do so desire to use it. In the lock position, none of these buttons or switches would work. The camera is turned off basically. It's the perfect position to put it if you're packing this camera. The battery's check position. If you have sufficient battery, just pay attention. You just switch it there and see that red light right there, and that just shows that there's sufficient battery power. One thing I love about this camera, after using digital cameras for my business, it's just a luxury, my friends. It's really a luxury to have a camera that does not require you every 40 minutes taking out the battery and swapping the battery dead. You know, it's a real treat to have a camera that can have a battery that will last for months and months, you know. It's a real treat, and that's one of the beautiful things about film photography is you practically don't have to worry about batteries. Even for cameras like this that uses batteries, you don't have to worry about them. They're pretty sweet to work with. Speaking of batteries, that's a battery compartment. It takes 2 AA batteries right there. Nothing complicated about that. And that's one of the reasons why I tell you this camera is really that awesome. The other feature that I want to talk about here is this little button here. If you were to shoot a subject in the backlit situation, what you will end up with is an underexposed image, basically, because these cameras, and this camera as well, it has a centered metering system. So the metering for this camera is right smack down in the center, and oftentimes the light from the backlight it just bleeds over your subject, and what happens is that it gives the camera a false reading of how much light is coming from your subject. So the camera actually ends up compensating or exposing for the light and not for your subject. In a situation like that, the way other cameras work is that they have an auto exposure hold button, whereby, and I've talked about that in the past, for those buttons you just press on the hold button, and then you depress the shutter slightly, and that way you're able to go close to your subject and get a reading of the light coming straight from your subject without the backlight. And then while you're still holding onto that button, you come back to your position where you want to compose the image, and then you fire fully the shutter. So what it will do is basically hold the light reading for your subject. So you're basically exposing for the shadows and not for the backlight. Those situations work pretty well. The only problem with that is that oftentimes you may end up with blown out skies, because you're now exposing for the shadows, but there's also the light that you have to worry about. It will give you the right exposure for your subject. However, it will also end up with overly exposed background, in this case the backlight, right? What this camera does differently, it's almost like a middle ground. When there's a backlit situation, there's a button right here, and you can see it says backlight, and it says plus 1.5. And what this camera is basically doing is that if you hold onto this button right here and focus on your subject, you don't have to go close to your subject. You just basically go ahead and shoot your picture from your position where you would like to compose the image. This camera automatically overexposes the image by 1.5 stops, and that's why it says plus 1.5. And in that case, it actually works well, because now what it's doing is that it's sort of like a middle ground, because oftentimes from your subject to a backlight, it's about 3 stops really. In a lot of the situations that I've been in, it's about 3 stops. And what it's doing is that it's giving you sort of a middle ground. So it's not just exposing for the shadows, but it's not exposing for the backlight, it's exposing for somewhere in between. I think it's a pretty decent compromise, and it's good that this camera has that. So having this feature really helps. Advantages of this camera: pretty light, the ergonomic design is excellent, the battery usage on this camera is excellent. I haven't had to change the battery yet. Sometimes I even forget to put it in the lock position, and I haven't run out of battery yet. It's excellent. I would have preferred if the ISO dial was the one that overrides or determines the ISO and not the DX code on the film. But it's good in a sense because some people may forget to set the ISO here, and so the camera automatically takes your ISO reading from your film. But the problem with that is that most of the film that we use is better to actually overexpose them by about a stop. And whenever I don't, I end up with images that usually don't have a lot of detail in the shadows. So those are my thoughts about this camera. I would totally recommend this camera for any of you guys out there that are looking to get into film photography. By all means, guys, go for it. By all means. I mean, if you want to get into film, it's so simple to operate this camera. If you're already into film or you're already a photographer, you want to try film, my goodness, go for this camera. It is certainly highly recommended. It's a very versatile camera, very nice to shoot with. The shutter sounds amazing, really amazing. I love it, actually. So anyways, hey, thanks for joining me on this episode. We'll be coming up with a review of the lens, this particular lens that is on this camera. That's an f2.8, and I believe this one here is the SMC brand. Is the Asahi Pentax SMC 28 millimeters, and I will be doing a review of this lens, this particular lens, next, and I'll be showcasing some images that I took with this lens as well. So until the next time, guys, I hope you have a wonderful day, and as always, stay safe.